Welcome back from your break. I hope your brains are now bright and ready for the next section. Now, in plants, questions are often asked in regard to different experiments that have been done on how plants function. And I know that section is quite difficult for some of you, so we're going to do a little bit of explaining on the scientific method. And in your scientific method, there are two very important aspects. You first need to know what some things called variables are. Then we will have a look at how scientists report what they've known and the best way to write these terms, which I'm sure you've all heard of, but you might find are not particularly easy to do. Okay, so let's go straight on and have a look at scientific skills. You can sometimes be given pictures of experiments you've never seen before, and you have to be able to work out what is going on in them. And to be able to do that, you need to have an understanding of how scientists work. Okay, and that is called scientific skills, and that's what we're going to just have a look at to try and help you understand. Scientists work on something called the scientific method. They look at things, they observe, they wonder, I wonder why that's that color, or I wonder how this works. But they do more than wonder. They actually investigate and they do experiments to collect evidence so that they can say, aha, I know how this works. And there's a certain pattern or method that they use to be able to do this. First thing is, when you do any experiment, you have to know that there are things called variables, things that can change or vary. Okay, and they are factors of an experiment which can cause change. And there's three types of variables that are important, and one is the independent variable, and that is the one that you change. You decide you're going to change this to see what happens. And what will happen because you've changed that is called the dependent variable, and that's the one that you measure at the end of an experiment. The third type is fixed or controlled variables, and these are variables that could mess up your experiment. So you've got to keep them constant if you want your experiment to be a fair test. And I'm sure you've heard of a fair test before. Let's give an example. There are these 5 boys in grade 10, and they don't really believe their teacher knows what she's doing. And she's told them that the brighter the light they put on their pot plant, the more water the pot plant will lose in transpiration. And they decide, let's check and see if she is telling the truth. So they decide to do an experiment. And for this experiment, they first have to look at what are they going to change, what are they going to measure, and what are they going to keep constant in the experiment. And so what they decided they would do is they would change the amount of light. Put the pot plant there, give it a bright light, or put it in a dark room and see how much water it loses. So what they would measure is how much water the plant is losing. Then, to make sure that the experiment actually works, they need to look at what other factors could affect transpiration, and those they need to keep the same. Okay, and from our lesson on transpiration, we know that temperature affects transpiration, so they would have to keep the temperature the same. Humidity affects transpiration, so they would have to keep humidity the same. Wind affects transpiration, so they would have to have the same amount of air movement. And then lastly, they must use the same plant. Because if they used a different plant, it might have a different number of leaves, which means it would lose more or less water. So they would have to use the same plant for that. Now, if there is a change as they make the light brighter, the plant does lose more water, they will know our experiment is working. The change in what you measure, which is how much water is lost, is because they have changed the amount of light. But that only works if the other variables are kept constant. For example, if they put it in a hot room and a cold room, it might be losing less water because of the temperature, not necessarily because of the light. Then, what scientists do is once they've done the experiment and they're like, yes, it works, they have to write a report so that they can share their findings with other people in the scientific community. So they write a scientific report. And this, I'm sure you are familiar with, because in your natural science, whenever you've done an experiment, you've actually come in contact with these different terms, and you should know how most of this works. So, they have to follow the same format, and the first thing the scientists say, what is their aim? What are they actually trying to do? Now, how do scientists write a scientific aim? Okay, there's a set pattern for how they write. For example, there is an investigation word. They then refer to the independent variable and relationship word, how it's going to affect what they are measuring. So let's look at that in terms of the experiment that the boys did. The investigation word was to see if. It could be to determine whether, to find out if. Then they mention their independent variable, which is the brightness of the light. Then they mention the relationship word. In other words, what's that going to do? Will it increase or decrease? Then, what are they going to measure? They are going to measure transpiration. Then, another one which I think everybody hates, and that is something called a hypothesis. It's a very big word, but it is actually quite simple. Because when you're doing an experiment, a hypothesis is what you think will happen, what you predict will happen in your experiment. And you know what? If you're wrong, it doesn't matter. In fact, sometimes scientists learn more from when their experiments don't work than when their experiments do work. Okay, so we're looking at a hypothesis here, and it's a smart guess. Doesn't have to be smart. It can just be a guess, but it's you or the scientist thinking about what the result of the experiment will be. And it's always written as a statement. So, for example, our boys, if they wrote their hypothesis, they would say, right, increasing the brightness of the light. That is your independent variable. Will increase. That's your relationship word. And what are you going to measure? The amount of water lost in transpiration. So if you look at this, it's actually very similar to the aim. It's just expressed slightly differently. Then, the rest of the scientific method you should be quite familiar with, because when you've done experiments, you've looked at the method, the results, where you write down, does it change color, or you might measure something. If you measure and you get figures, you would use a table. Okay, so you can have results. So there's method, how you're going to do it, results, which can be observations or measurements. And measurements are often recorded in a table, which makes it easier to read, or even a graph, which means you can look at the graph and you can understand how your experiment is working. Then, next one, conclusion. Okay, and in the conclusion, you put down your thoughts. What has actually happened in this experiment? Has it worked? Has it not worked? Is my hypothesis correct? What can I do to actually, if I do it again, actually make it work? So let's have a look at our boys' conclusion. Okay, so the boys' conclusion could be the brighter the light, the greater the transpiration, or it could be expressed in a different way as an increase in light intensity, which is the same as saying the brighter the light, and the rate of transpiration, which is the same as saying the amount of water lost. Both of these, though expressed differently, would be perfect for conclusions because they're mentioning the independent variable, the dependent variable, and the relationship word. So, what we've looked at are variables and the scientific method. After the break, we're going to look at an example and work out how to answer questions on experiments like this.